And back to another lecture on the respiratory system. So this is what I ended with the last respiratory system lecture video. These are actually the muscles of breathing. So in this case, there's actually two muscles only required for, in this case, normal, or what we term as quiet breathing. And those are the external intercostals as well as the diaphragm. The diaphragm is obviously the muscle that divides the thoracic cavity from the abdominal pelvic cavity, right? So it's a big dome-like muscle. It actually flattens out during inspiration. The external intercostals, the reason why they're called intercostals is because they are actually, in this case, between ribs. That is why they're actually called intercostals. And the reason why they're called external is because they're on the outer layer, okay, as shown here. So those are the two skeletal muscles of breathing for quiet or normal breathing. Now, all of these other muscles that actually are shown here are utilized when you actually have what we call labored, or in this case, heavy breathing. Okay, so you actually have muscles for inspiration, which is primarily more on your neck and back area. This is a neck muscle, right? Shoulder area, all right? And then the back muscle, which is the rectus-spinae muscle. And then most of the lower muscles, which is primarily around your, in this case, your abdomen, like the external oblique and the transversus abdominis, are actually muscles of forced expiration. So again, normal quiet breathing, in this case, labored breathing in this case, or abnormal breathing, okay? So why do we need this muscle? So this is coming from, in this case, I hope that you remember, this is actually coming from, in this case, the law of diffusion. And the law of diffusion, in this case, we're actually talking about Boyle's law in this case, is, and we're going to just segue them together. So gases always flow from an area of higher pressure, okay, to an area of lower pressure. Now, atmospheric pressure, which is shown here, which is outside air at room temp, like in this case at sea level, like Wisconsin, all right, is around 760 millimeters mercury. So that's just the pressure exerted by outside air on your skin and also into your respiratory system, okay, into your respiratory tract here in this case. So what happens is the reason why you need to change pressures and volumes is because you again want air to be moving in or out depending on what you want to do. So during inspiration, quiet inspiration, which only involves two muscles, which is the intercostal and the diaphragm muscle. So inspiration, just to show you again, there's this 1 and 2. So normally the pressure inside your lungs, okay, intrapulmonary pressure, and the pressure outside is equivalent, 760 millimeters of mercury. So when the pressure is the same, there's no movement of air in and out. So this is the start. Okay, so they're equal to each other. However, as you inspire, the diaphragm, which was dome-shaped before, now basically becomes flat, as shown here. And what that does is it creates a greater volume in the intrapulmonary space. So what happens with this pressure is before it was 760, now it goes down to 759. Okay, and FY intrapleural pressure is we're going to be talking about. We're not going to be talking about that in great extent on this class. As you can see now, it's 715 millimeters of mercury, which is obviously less than atmospheric pressure. So what happens then is since gases flow from an area of greater pressure to lower pressure, that is why during inspiration, actually air rushes into the lungs. And again, the reason why that is because the pressure outside is going to be greater than the pressure inside, which is accomplished by the changes in volume from the flattening of the diaphragm. Okay? It's the opposite during expiration. So in expiration, what happens is obviously this, okay, diaphragm then relaxes, okay, and what happens is it becomes dome shaped, and now this pressure now changes since the volume has now become smaller, okay, right? The pressure increases. And since the pressure is now greater than the atmospheric pressure outside. Now it's at 761 as opposed to 760. That is why during expiration, air actually flows out. So this is just revisiting Boyle's law, which is pressure volume. Okay, P1 V1 equals P2 V2. How do you make the pressure greater? By making the volume smaller. How do you make the pressure lower? By making the volume greater. Okay, and that is what is accomplished by this diagram here. Now, obviously, there has to be a mechanism in controlling respirations, and that is actually in this case controlled by the nervous system. And here in this diagram here are actually two regions is shown to you, and this is actually the pons of the brainstem and the medulla oblongata. Okay, medulla oblongata and in this case the pons. And in the pons, you actually have two areas that's not shown here. You actually have the apneustic area and the pneumotaxic area. And in the medulla, you actually have the ventral respiratory group, which means it's in front, anterior, and you have the dorsal respiratory group, which is posterior. This is going to be a very complicated explanation, so I want you to hold on to your horses and basically just listen very, very carefully, okay? So during normal breathing, the area that is active, that actually controls normal or quiet breathing, is actually the ventral respiratory group, which is shown here. Okay, so that means there's no stress, you're just relaxing, all right, you rest and digest, okay? So what happens is, normally speaking, as you guys can see, red is actually a motor neuron, meaning to say it's actually exiting, okay? And green is actually a sensory neuron, meaning it's entering, okay, this area. So during normal breathing, the VRG sends a 2-second stimulatory response via neuron to your two muscles of quiet breathing, the external intercostal muscles and your diaphragm. Okay? So what happens then is, as the neurons from your VRG fire, okay, for 2 seconds, after that, there's a feedback loop which actually then inhibits the same neurons from firing, which lasts for approximately 5 seconds. So there's a signal that comes from here for 2 seconds, and then for 3 seconds, the inspiratory neurons, okay, actually stop firing. So when the inspiratory neurons fire, the intercostal muscles and the diaphragm actually contract, meaning that's inhalation, that's inspiratory, okay? During the 3 seconds that there's no signal, the diaphragm and the intercostal muscles have no signals going on to them, so what happens is relaxation. So that's actually exhalation. So exhalation in this case during quiet breathing is actually a passive response, or passive, in this case, process. Okay? Now, what is all of these things? So what happens is, during perturbations or during problems with, in this case, homeostatic imbalances, which is shown here, and the biggest driver of the respiratory rate is actually an increase in blood carbon dioxide levels. And carbon dioxide levels is actually monitored in two main places: in the central chemoreceptors, which is present in the medulla itself, and in the peripheral chemoreceptors, which is present in your carotid arteries and in your aorta. Okay? So their purpose, these three sites, actually two main sites, central and peripheral chemoreceptors, is to detect carbon dioxide levels. As shown up here, when you have an increase in carbon dioxide levels, what happens is carbon dioxide then gets combined with water to create this species called carbonic acid. This is actually carbonic acid, which has split up. When carbonic acid is created, carbonic acid splits up into the bicarbonate ion and the hydrogen ion. The hydrogen ion lowers your pH. So normal arterial pH is between 7.35 to 7.45. So when you have too much carbon dioxide in the blood, whether it's detected by the central chemoreceptors or the peripheral chemoreceptors, the pH is now below 7.35. Okay? So because of that, signals then travel to the dorsal respiratory group to basically say, I need to get rid of carbon dioxide. If that occurs, the dorsal respiratory group in turn sends a signal to the to the ventral respiratory group to increase the rate of respiration, increase the rate and depth of respiration. So what happens is then respiratory rate then increases because of this input, and what happens is your respirations then increase the depth and rate. So now what happens is you are now expelling more carbon dioxide. Okay, and if you expel more carbon dioxide, what you're doing is you're actually getting rid of this hydrogen ion. So what happens now is your pH now goes back up from below 7.35 to within that normal range of 7.35 to 7.45. Okay, that's the biggest driver. Now there are other things. Okay, so actually in this case you can control. So this is actually from your cerebral cortex. This is actually from your motor gyrus. Okay, which is in the frontal lobe. You can control your respiratory rate as well consciously. Okay, however, just to tell you, if you try to hold your breath for too long, you're going to pass out, and then guess what? Who's going to take over? VRG. Okay, there are other things. Pain. Okay, what happens is when you, in this case, loses your balance, proprioceptors. This is why you actually kind of like gasp when you're about to fall. Okay, proprioceptors. Stretch receptors. So your lungs cannot get too big. If you inflate the lungs too much, what happens to your lungs? They pop. They blow up like a balloon. So there's stretch receptors that actually in this case, it tells them, oh, you're going too much. Please stop. That is actually a feedback that actually comes from, in this case, from the lungs itself. And obviously irritant receptors. Okay, so if you have irritant in here, you want to hold your breath. And so that is actually, again, in this case, an inhibitory response. But again, the primary driver of why your respiratory rate would increase is actually through the levels of carbon dioxide. It's the opposite, okay? So if you have not enough carbon dioxide, which means your pH is going to be higher than 7.45, your respiratory is going to slow down because you want to keep carbon dioxide. If you keep carbon dioxide, your pH actually goes up, okay? So too much carbon dioxide, low pH. Not enough carbon dioxide, okay, high pH. All right, so again, we're talking about the Goldilocks area, which is just right, 7.35 to 7.45. Now, the pontine respiratory area, which is the apneustic and the pneumotaxic area, actually also controls the rate and depth of respiration. So the apneustic area, actually in this case, is predominantly responsible in this case for slowing down. So you actually have irregular heart like respirations when you actually have the apneustic area active. The pneumotaxic area, the reason why it's called pneumotaxic, pneumo means respiration, taxi means faster, actually makes your breathing deeper and higher as well. Okay, and again, there's many reasons why that's the case, but again, predominantly speaking from, again, low pH. Okay, so I hope that you understand how this nervous system, control of the nervous system of your respiratory rate is actually involved. Now, there's other things here. Blood levels of O2 actually does not play an important role. Once the blood levels of O2 plays an important role in your respiratory rate, you're basically almost dead. But the carbon dioxide and the hydrogen levels are actually related. Again, too much carbon dioxide means too much hydrogen ions. And then also the venous return of blood. The more blood, the more fluid returns to your heart, the deeper the rate of respiration, the deeper the respiration. Why? Because what that means is you need to have more blood oxygenated. Okay? So if you have shallow breathing, not swallow, but shallow breathing, what happens then is blood is going too fast through the lungs, which means to say that blood is not getting enough oxygenation, especially if you have a lot of blood returning to the heart. So the more blood returns to the heart, the deeper, right, the respirations. Why? Because you want time for blood to actually passage through the lungs and get those red blood cells to actually pick up those important oxygen molecules. Okay? Quiet breathing, VRG. Abnormal breathing, DRG.